you know your body parts, your colors. The reality is she was coming from a very supportive place, and she had some structures. What I later learned when I got into the governor's office and started working with kids from across the 1.2 million students in the Commonwealth of Virginia was the disparity from one county just to the next county and from one part of our country to the next part of our country. And so I'm excited about the perspective Albert's going to bring, hearing from Superintendent Hoffman in Arizona and certainly Secretary Stewart in New Mexico. This pandemic has had a tremendous impact on this early childhood community. The workforce has been devastated. The focus and attention have been placed on childcare workers, the actual compensation, the issues that we've confronted as a society and as a group of policymakers, and certainly working with our elected leaders. It's really been an opportunity. So I hope we will take advantage of the opportunity, the attention being afforded to the early childhood community, and certainly the impact it's going to have as our babies transition into kindergarten and beyond for their development. So I'm very confident we're going to hear some great insights from these three incredible leaders who are going to discuss what is happening at the K-12 level to ensure students are able to have that smooth transition and certainly setting a foundation for long-term success. So I want to thank our friends for joining us this afternoon to have this very important conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Julia, but I do want to acknowledge Julia Cunningham because this is the 1 year-ish, give or take a few days, anniversary of our first webinar, national webinar series we launched with a group of superintendents last year in April after the pandemic. So Julia, thanks for your great work in leading these conversations, and I'll turn it back over to you to get our conversation started.
Thanks, Ray. I appreciate that. And yes, this is the almost exact 1 year anniversary. So we're excited that we've been able to have, I think, somewhere around 20 of these conversations throughout the year. And, we're hoping to continue them and really create important solutions for students around the country. A couple of really quick logistical notes. If you have any questions, please submit them into the Q&A and we'll have some time dedicated to the end to get to those. And with that, I want to just really start our conversation and have as much time as possible to hear from our experts. So I'm going to start with Albert. Albert is the Senior Policy Director at the Alliance for Early Success. And Albert, I was hoping you could just provide us with some context around this conversation of kindergarten readiness and how COVID has really impacted kindergarten readiness around the country and what people are really thinking about as students are going to be transitioning into kindergarten in the fall.
Yeah, thank you for that, Julia, and thank you for having me to the Hunt Institute. And let me just kind of preface my comments by also saying that the Alliance for Early Success, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is we are basically a community, a network of advocates and policy folks who are working to advance early childhood policies and early learning, family supports, and health across the country in all 50 states and at the national level. And so I preface that by, with that also to say that, what I might lack in depth that hopefully the superintendent and secretary will bring, I hopefully will make up for that with some breadth. So, and to answer your question, Julia, I think there are a couple of ways I'm looking at this transition during this time. One is that we all know that kids are returning to school, whether it's pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, without kind of a typical pre-K or kindergarten experience that's going into those grades, right? So, and we also know that based on some research, for example, from the National Institute for Early Education Research, that enrollment in pre-K specifically and kindergarten has gone down a bit, and particularly for families of color and families of, with low income. And so one thing I want to suggest is in terms of transitioning and from a racial equity perspective is that I hope that school systems, whether the local or state level, are really considering high quality pre-K and full day kindergarten and expanding those opportunities as part of their long-term kind of recovery strategy. The other thing I would say is that, once we get the kids back in the classroom, hopefully we'll have more of them back in the classroom in the fall, that, many people are beginning to talk about the importance of responding effectively to issues related to the mental health and trauma. We know that the pandemic has hit communities of color and low-income communities especially hard, and those communities have really experiencing more material hardships, whether it's food insecurity, housing issues, paying the bills, utility bills, and whatnot, and experiencing more illness and deaths than other families. And all of that, of course, creates stress in the families and likely impacts on the mental health of both children and parents. And again, all this has implications, of course, on children's behaviors and the capacity to focus and learn. And before I get to sort of talk about a little bit of like what some of those responses could be, we also need to remember that even before the pandemic, children of color, and particularly boys of color, are disproportionately subject to exposure and suspensions, even starting in pre-K. So as more children return to school this spring and next fall, given everything that, in terms of mental health and trauma that I talked about, if we're going to go back to business as usual, we'll see those inequities is exacerbated in our school system. So really important to think about, many people are also beginning to talk a lot more about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and thinking about kids' safety and belonging, as they think about the academics. So we're really promoting social emotional development and as they work on the content knowledge and language and literacy and math skills. And we also need to think about how to strengthen teachers' training and supports around these skills. Have them provide the mental health supports and trauma-informed practices that are needed right now. So that means effectively strengthening executive function skills like self-regulation and mindfulness among the kids, and also managing challenging behaviors. I'm thinking about mental health supports, coaches and consultants, counselors. I'm thinking about, expanding access to, pyramid or multi-tiered intervention models like PBIS and things like that. Even just strengthening teachers' observation and assessment skills around social emotional learning, which is not always, a given in terms of teachers' repertoire. And then, of course, ratios and class sizes, paying attention to those things at the lower grades, so that kids do get more individualized attention, and then finally paying attention to teachers' own well-being and what we can do to support, programs and interventions support teachers' own social emotional health, so that they can provide the kind of instruction and support that kids need at this time.
Thank you so much, Albert. That's a really great framing to start this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over now to Secretary Stewart. Secretary Stewart, I was hoping that you could speak a bit towards what you all are doing in New Mexico to support some of this work and, implement some of these needs that Albert talked about.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Albert, and also thank you, Dr. Siddiqui, for acknowledging the tough moment that we're in and the tragedies that so many of our communities are facing. It reinforces the need to make sure that we've got schools as very safe, inclusive places that are really championing inclusion and welcoming people and fostering critical dialogue around these issues. So thank you for those words, and looking forward to the conversation here today. Albert, as you were just talking there, it just made me think maybe one thing that we need to do even more of here in New Mexico is thinking about those students who might have usually attended a pre-K program but didn't. I know I'll talk a little bit about things that we've got going with our early childhood providers and those who are currently in early childhood programs, but that's a critical constituency as well. To talk a little bit about some of the things that we've got going on in New Mexico, there are a lot of logistical challenges in the kindergarten transition that I think really get highlighted during the pandemic that we're problem solving around to make sure that we can have effective transition programs. So even things that we do like health screenings and wellness screenings that typically happen in that transition process, we really had to work to think about how we can make those still doable in a safe and socially distanced manner during the pandemic. So that's required more coordination with some of our partners in that area to think about how we can create the processes to do those effectively. Additionally, one of the things that we've been working on too are around coordination between early child care centers and their kindergarten counterparts in the public space, pre-K visits. So many of our kindergarten teachers have the chance to visit their pre-K classrooms and meet the students and set them up for a really successful transition into the kindergarten space. And we've been challenged to do that physically during the pandemic. So we've had to really work to coordinate a system to set that up virtually so that we can continue that process and make sure that those visits continue to happen and those transitions can continue to go around smoothly. And one thing that's been really important as well, we have in our system, our early childhood centers have stayed open even when our school buildings were closed, particularly for our frontline essential workers. And even beyond that too, but particularly for those groups. So I think a part of the work around early childhood and then the kindergarten transition has been continuing to work with those early childhood educators, both to make sure that their contributions have been recognized, because they really have gone above and beyond throughout this transition to make sure that this essential service to our society was still available. And then as we continue to go, we're looking at, and I know we have at least one of our large districts, and we're trying to get more to do this, use some of their federal dollars to think about summer programs. Now that we're in a new phase of the pandemic and we're open to more in-person learning, that can help support a strong transition program and engage in some of those activities that they weren't otherwise able to engage in during the pandemic. So we have some of those in the work, and we're doing webinars to help showcase what excellence looks like in some of these transition activities that are happening both in the kindergarten space and in the early childhood space. So we can share those across the state. And then we're doing a lot of work around expanding our pre-K. And I know Dr. Watt talked about this in his opening. So that's been an important key initiative for the state, for the governor. And so we do have a lot of work to continue to expand those pre-K slots. We have a mixed delivery system throughout the private and the public sector. And so in both cases, we're trying to identify where we have the biggest service gaps and be very intentional about trying to get more students into those pre-K slots in the areas where we have some of the biggest gaps between available slots and number of students who are there. So those are just a few of the things that we're trying to do to make sure that our transition program can continue to work, and that we're able to move closer and closer toward universal pre-K in the state. And so I look forward to the ongoing conversation around additional strategies that are working.
Thank you so much, Secretary. And I'm really impressed how much information you got in such a short time frame there. That was really impressive. So we're going to turn it now over to Superintendent Hoffman from Arizona. And Superintendent Hoffman, I was hoping you could, similarly touch on what you all are doing in Arizona around this right now.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much to the Hunt Institute for having me. And I want to first say how much I appreciate the comments that have already been made. So first, to give a little bit of context of even my own personal background, I started my career as a preschool teacher, and then I became a speech-language pathologist working in K-8 schools primarily. So during that time, having worked first as a preschool teacher and then working especially with our younger grades as a speech pathologist, I saw firsthand the importance of that transition. And unfortunately, here in Arizona, we do not have a lot of in terms of our legislature, there's not a lot of priority placed on early education. And we actually do not have any state funding dedicated to early education in Arizona, which has been not only a major setback for our state, but truly an embarrassment for Arizona that there's this disregard around the value of early education. I have visited schools across the state that have had to cut other services or even their PE types of extracurricular classes because they wanted to be able to fund full day kindergarten. But as a state, we don't even fund full day kindergarten. We only fund half day. So we have a lot of catch up to do here in Arizona. We used to also receive the federal preschool development grant to help with our preschool programs, but we lost that funding because Arizona was not demonstrating sustainability and dedicated funding to support that programming as well. So that's I just needed to provide some of that background and context of these are issues that we've been facing pre-pandemic. So now with the pandemic, this has hit Arizona really hard. Our latest data, a couple different data points to look to is that our enrollment in preschool declined. So we're down to 19% of our 3 to 4-year-olds who were enrolled in preschool programs last year in 2020. And then when we look at our enrollment declines statewide, we see that the most significant decreases in enrollment, roughly 42% of our enrollment declines, are attributed to our pre-K and kindergarten students. So we do know that there has been significant declines in participation of our early education programs because of COVID-19. That said, there is a lot of opportunity and hope. Our department, our early education team works very closely. We have strong partnerships with organizations across the state. And so we collaborate both in Arizona and out of state to bring high quality professional development and learning opportunities to our educators. We are always seeking out new grants and initiatives so that we can provide better learning opportunities for our youngest students. So I know that this past year has been very challenging, but we will continue to work closely by educating and advocating at the legislative level and working with our partners to find solutions. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in today's webinar.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all three of you for setting such a great stage for the rest of the conversation. The remaining 40-ish minutes is going to be really devoted to Q&A and being able to answer some of those more specific questions. Just a couple quick notes about that. There are about almost 300 people on this webinar right now, and so unfortunately we won't be unmuting lines or anything like that. Can get quite confusing, as I'm sure some of you have experienced in other Zoom contexts. So if you do have a question, we would love to be able to answer it. Please submit it into the Q&A and we will try to get through as many of those as we can. I'm going to start off. I have a couple questions for our panelists, and then we'll jump into those more specific questions that you all have. I'll start with Albert. And these questions were developed before the events of the last couple of weeks, but I think they're even more relevant now. So thinking about the events of the last year, education is placing such an emphasis on developmentally appropriate practices and really intentionally supporting racial equity. And so when we're thinking about children's transition into kindergarten, how are you seeing these developmental practices combined with racial equity practices into an early childhood system?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, and I think that some of what I shared in the opening is really, hopefully it will speak to the racial equity issue as well, right? So again, we know that the pandemic is, because of the systemic racism and the impacts of poverty in our society, before the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, those families really bore the brunt of the impacts of whether it's, families losing job or losing loved ones or being, very sick. And not to mention, again, the police, violence and racial injustice that we've all seen, not only in the last year, but in recent years. All those things add up to the experiences of kids at home, in the communities. And so again, when kids go back to school more and more in in-person format in this fall, it is more important than ever to really especially at the early grades, to make sure that teachers are well trained and supported to practice developmentally appropriate practice with their kids. That means using those kind of evidence-based, play-based, and child-centered learning strategies, and again promoting those social emotional development skills while working on the language and literacy and math and other content areas. And again, I also want to just kind of reiterate the importance of, I think a lot of what I've seen so far, and Secretary Stewart kind of spoke to this, is, we're seeing a lot of states, with the ARP dollars, putting them in summer programs, after school programs, and tutoring, and all those things are great. I really want to emphasize that, those strategies need to have a really kind of core component around social emotional development and mental health supports. Again, whether it's counselors or training for teachers, or again, and supporting teachers' own mental health, that has to be part of the design of those programs. Otherwise, I think if we all focus on kind of quote unquote catching kids up with academics, we're just going to lose more of the kids, again, and especially those kids who have been hit hardest by the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Really great points there. And kind of building off that a little bit, great transition into a social emotional learning question for Superintendent Hoffman. So many students have been socially isolated over the last year, and this is such a crucial stage for developing those skills. What are some of the strategies that states should be thinking about for supporting this transition in terms of those skills that students really need?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for this question, because the social emotional piece is so critical as our students have experienced various types of trauma over the past year, as was previously mentioned, whether that's food insecurity or loss of a loved one, or just simply the social isolation of being at home for a whole school year. So we do take this very seriously. A couple of different strategies and the way we're thinking this through is one, by providing professional development to our educators. So last year we brought in Ricky Robertson virtually, an expert in this area of trauma-informed practices, and we had over 8,000 educators participate in this professional development opportunity. So clearly the demand is also there, and we had great feedback from this training series. We're also looking for ways to expand the number of school counselor and social worker positions in our schools. We know that this is also critical for helping provide supports not just to our students in the schools, but also to the parents, especially in thinking about the role of social workers and making sure that they can help make connections between services in the community and the families and the students, and just really strengthening those relationships between the school and the home, I think is also, and to those community services is also a critical piece. And then we are also implementing, and we've been promoting that our department recently adopted social emotional learning competencies in a partnership with CASEL. So we are offering or planning to offer more trainings and more resources. This is, of course, optional for schools to implement, but we do recommend that they integrate the social emotional learning components in their everyday activities, that it shouldn't be a separate thing. It really should be integrated into the everyday, because it's just so critical for the development and so that kids are ready to learn.
Thank you. And we actually had someone from CASEL on our webinar in February, and he spoke a lot about some of the work that you all are doing there. So for Secretary Stewart, I would love to hear a bit about this question between the transition between different early childcare programs and at-home systems, and how can states better coordinate that kindergarten transition activities, between the early care and learning programs to create these systems that support children and families?
Yeah, great question, and I'd say a couple of things in response. So one is one strategy to really consider is thinking about strategically and intentionally creating collaborative communities between your pre-K providers, whether again they be part of your public program or your private or your Head Start, and the local public schools to which students are going to be transitioning, so that there's ongoing facilitated dialogue between those groups, so that they're constantly in communication with each other around a clear set of purposes that they either construct themselves or that you can help them construct, so that they can be thinking strategically together throughout the course of the school year. We've seen places where we have the strongest collaboratives who are there, who meet either on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis, and sometimes even more often than that. Those are the ones where the transition programs, the parent relationships, and the school relationships tend to be very strong. And there's other ancillary benefits to having those partnerships as well, beyond just the transition process. So I think those collaborative pieces are important. Another thing for our principals, especially those who maybe don't have a lot of experience in the pre-K early childhood setting, is to really have programs in place to help them understand and be trained in some of those really important aspects of the early childhood program and what those transition elements are. For many of our principals, it's new to them, and if there's not something that they can latch onto, they kind of learn it on their own, hopefully. So the more that we can be strategic about it and think systematically about it, the better off that they're going to be prepared to make a strong transition bridge for their students. And then the last thing I would say are, and this is kind of more both in the relationship and communication aspect, when you have a mixed delivery system like many of our states do, where you have public pre-K, private pre-K, your Head Starts, making sure that you're inclusive of all of those groups in the events that happen, the programs that happen, the transition activities that happen to go from the early childhood setting into the public school. In many cases, you might see that it may only be one of those groups that gets invited to the transition meetings or has those screenings or the school visits from teachers. And if you can do that across the spectrum, it builds those bridges and makes it so that all those students have equitable access to the services that are provided.
Julia, can I add on to what Secretary said and agree 100% with everything he said? I would also add that, and also thank you to the Secretary for earlier acknowledging that early child education programs have been open. Many of them have been open all this time. And so what that means is they're serving kids in person, and many of those kids are going to be entering the public school system in the coming fall. And so I would encourage somehow for, again, at the local or state level to sort of support principals and teachers and other folks to listen to what the experience of the early child education programs have been. What kind of behaviors are they seeing in the kids? How are they been responding? What has worked? What hasn't worked? There was a small study that was done by the National Center for Children in Poverty and other researchers to look at the early child educators' experience in Arkansas. And as expected, what you found is they were seeing more challenging behaviors in kids, which led to different more directive kind of teaching behaviors from the educators. Partly also because of the pandemic, it's hard to kind of do more kind of interactive stuff with kids. And what that means for the kids' learning and development. So just kind of basic point of I would try to really listen to what the experience of those educators and families who went through those, whose kids were in those programs, what their experiences are, and kind of learn as much as we can from it and to inform the transition process and the education process in the schools.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to transition us over to something slightly different, a little bit more around data. And so I'm going to direct this towards Albert, but Superintendent Hoffman and Secretary Stewart, I'd also love to hear kind of what you're specifically doing in your states, if anything. But do you have any data around students who were in kindergarten in the 2021 school year, and how they were prepared coming in from that first few months of craziness? And are we seeing any indicators around how well they were able to learn in a virtual learning setting? And I'll start with Albert on that one, if you have anything to offer there.
Yeah, I think I would look to some of the research that's been done by the National Institute for Early Education Research. I don't know if they have any sort of quantitative data about how kids learning, what kids learning look like from remote instruction, but I do think that they have been capturing families' experiences of their kids learning, remotely and their own their own learning at home. So I can drop some of that link of that study into the chat. Shortly.
Yeah, that'd be great. And Secretary Stewart, Superintendent Hoffman, if you have anything that you'd like to add in there, you're more than welcome to.
We do not have that type of data, especially for kindergarten levels, because in order to collect that type of academic data, we would need to administer the state assessment, which we're currently in the process of administering, but that's for third grade and up. So unfortunately, we don't have at the state level that type of quantitative data, but I know that our schools are doing more like formative assessments or benchmark assessments or DIBELS, that type of those types of assessments. But unfortunately, we do not collect that at the state level.
And I would say for us, we get a lot of data from our early childhood observation tool, which we use in kindergarten and some of the early grades and then some of our early childhood settings. I do think that we don't have quite the same level in terms of the extensive data set, just given the impact of the pandemic and many of our students not having the same level of access to in-person learning. We have in the state we have throughout the pandemic had the option for all of our kindergarten students to be in school buildings throughout the year, either in a hybrid model or in like a 5-to-1 small group ratio, so that they would have a safe in-person learning environment even during the worst parts of the pandemic. But again, it did impact our ability to do some of our traditional assessments that we otherwise would have had. So I do know that we do have some data from our early childhood observation tool. I couldn't really speak to some of the trends there. I'd have to dive more into it to be able to pull that out.
Great, yeah, thank you. And so this is a question we got from several participants, and they were wondering, are there particular areas of kindergarten readiness, either academic or non-academic, where you think that children may be particularly struggling due to COVID? And, you know, when we talk about some of this summer learning work, what are some of those specific areas that are really going to have to be targeted in the summer learning to help kids get back to where we're hoping they might be? And so I'll start with Superintendent Hoffman on that one.
As you were asking this, my mind went to the impact of the digital divide in Arizona, because as I think about what students have lost or how their learning has been disrupted over the past year, it does look very different depending on what part of the state you live in, or what if you can afford internet, the access to having internet access and the technology and the family's skills to use the technology. So, I think about in some of our communities where internet is no problem and they have easy access, I saw some really great collaboration between teachers and parents and families, where there was a lot of coaching, a lot of just much more enhanced, stronger collaboration between the educators and the school with the families. And so in those cases where they have strong collaboration, I think that those students are probably going to be more prepared for whatever's coming next for them in this next year. However, our students, so part of Arizona and also New Mexico is Navajo Nation, where only about 30% of our students have access to internet, and even there, it's spotty, it's not stable, it's very slow. So in those communities, they've been relying on delivering packets, and a lot of those families have had very minimal interaction with the educators and with the teachers. So I think it's really going to vary significantly based on our families' ability to access education over the past year.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a great point, particularly thinking about the rurality of the digital divide in a lot of instances, and how a lot of times we think of that as as rural places as these kind of white communities, and forgetting that there's so much racial diversity in rural communities that we really need to be thinking about as well. Before I move on to a next question, I just wanted to see Albert or Secretary Stewart if you wanted to add anything on that question.
I would add, I'm not going to repeat my broken record about social emotional skills, but although that's important, but I think the other issue that comes up for me is around English language learners. And both, that's a pretty big population in both states, in Arizona and New Mexico. And I'm curious about whether the superintendent and secretary have any, what they think about that. But we know that, those kids, before the kindergarten, probably did not have the typical kind of early education experiences that they would have had if the pandemic didn't happen. And so, the exposure to English and, the opportunities to use it, how that impacts their, what their experiences in kindergarten, I think is something to be thinking about. And on the other hand, if they have really strong first language skills, because they've been at home and in the community, whether that's the predominant language, like that could be an asset to build on in terms of transition to English and learning English. So.
I would just add, absolutely, Albert, our English language learner population, it's been, when you combine English, learning English, and then also the lack of some of the online access that Superintendent Hoffman spoke of, it really does incredibly challenge that population of students in very significant ways. I think what we've seen in the data so far, Julia, is that generally what we've seen in our data is that we have some pockets where we've actually been able to maintain pretty well what we've normally seen. And then we have some other pockets where we're finding that students are falling behind. Certainly our hardest hit areas are the areas that tend to have the lack of internet access, the lack of resources in many of the communities that we've normally seen. I worry the most about early numeracy work, because even those families who have many families still have access to some books and reading opportunities, but it's a little bit harder, I think, to create those natural ways to do some of the introduction to number concepts and so on. So that's one area where I worry quite a bit.
Thank you so much. And I apologize, someone just decided to start mowing their lawn right outside, so there's a little bit of background noise. But one of the, I guess, the talk of the town the last couple of weeks has been around this infrastructure plan that we're talking about at the federal level, and we've been getting a number of questions around some of the thoughts and potential around this. So, there has been recent conversation about expanding the definition of of infrastructure to include some of these early childhood structures. And could this framing work to support this transition through early childhood and kindergarten through further funding, and how might that look at the state level? So Superintendent Hoffman and Secretary Stewart, I'd love for both of you to take a stab at this, and Albert, I'm sure you probably have some thoughts too. So I'll start with Secretary Stewart here.
So I think when it comes to resources and how we best use them in a way that builds the ability of our country to have a sustainable foundation, it's hard to argue that there are investments that are much more impactful than investing in our early childhood programs and the ability of our children to really grow and get the developmental opportunities that they need from a young age. So I absolutely think it's very justifiable, worthwhile, and investment of our funds to say that the core infrastructure of what we're going to be as a country is determined by the people that are going to be the drivers of our society. And our earliest kids need these investments. And if we're able to use them to make sure that we can have universal pre-K and make sure that we can have a workforce that is both compensated and trained and developed in the ways that our early childhood educators absolutely need to be and deserve to be, that is a wonderful investment in our future as a country.
I could not agree more, and Secretary Stewart said it so eloquently. The only thing I would add to that, besides all the benefits for our future generations of kids and what their future will look like, is one thing we see in Arizona with having such long wait lists for our high quality preschool centers is, to me, that indicates that working parents are also looking for a safe place for their kids to be able to learn and have high quality education in their early years. But it can also have an impact where I know even during COVID, we were seeing that a lot of mothers were not able to return back to work because of the need to take care of their young children. So the only piece I would add to that is that it has an impact both on our future workforce as well as our current workforce.
Yeah, so I echo those sentiments. I certainly think that, if we think of infrastructure as anything that, helps our economy run smoothly and get people, to work effectively, yes, those roads and bridges and broadband belong in that category, and so does early care education, and for that matter, public education. So there's no argument there. I think we know that in the infrastructure proposal right now, there's, we've seen the first part, the American Jobs Plan, includes significant funding for childcare facilities, early child education program facilities, which could, of course, address some of the shortage that we've been talking about potentially. In the ARP, there's quite a, $39 billion of support for childcare programs, which, a lot of it will go to stabilizing the childcare system that have been really devastated because of the pandemic. And we're hoping that, states will also use a lot of those dollars to think about how they can build a stronger childcare system that serves families and kids and educators, early child educators better. So whether that means improving the quality, improving collaboration with public school systems, et cetera, I think that's, there's an opportunity there. And I'm also hopeful that, I think both superintendent and secretary have really spoke eloquently about the importance of early care education, which is great. And I'm hopeful that that the school leaders across the country at the state and local level will also think about how to use it, leverage the public education dollars from the ESSER dollars from the ARP to support early learning, both in the school system, but also outside the school system.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have time for about 2 more questions. And I know usually I try to target all our questions at specific people, but I've been really appreciating all the insight that all 3 of you have been offering. So once again, these next 2 are going to be for all 3 of you. So we've established kind of early on in our conversation that there are, these significant kindergarten readiness gaps when it comes to students of color. And I was wondering if we could speak a bit more about the specific gaps that we're seeing, where are we, letting students kind of fall through the cracks in terms of getting them prepared for kindergarten? And is it an issue of access? Is it an issue of preparedness? Is it a combination of the 2? And kind of where are those challenges being seen? So I guess I will start with Albert this time. I'll kind of go in reverse.
Yeah, I see the question in the Q&A, and I don't know of a study that has measured this. I think that a lot of districts and states do have some kind of school readiness assessment or kindergarten readiness assessment. And, I think we need to be thinking about how to use those assessments strategically to understand where kids are at. Again, not just in the cognitive and the language and math skills, but also in the social, emotional, and executive function and those types of skills. And really meet the kids where they're at, right? Like, I think, yes, we need to be, I think, sort of help kids kind of get back, sort of quote, get back on track and kind of accelerate the learning, put them back in the learning trajectory in a more, in a more constructive way. But we also need to, do that by, meeting their kids where they're at, and in order to know where they're at, we need to assess them. And I know there's a kind of a debate between, how much we want to assess kids during these times, but my personal feeling is that you can't work, you can't support kids where that we can do the scaffolding that we know is so important unless you know where they're starting from, and that requires some form of assessment, even if it's just observational assessment by the teachers.
Thank you. And Superintendent and Secretary Hoffman, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I'll speak about this, and I'll say this more anecdotally than I will based on a kind of a comprehensive study. But we have I think we have a rural and urban divide when it comes to this. In our rural areas, I think we have a lot fewer options for high quality early childhood programs and facilities that are there. And so in those senses, that's one piece of the early childhood puzzle that we have to really invest in, both as a state and as a nation, to make sure that that there are those programs available, and you don't just have to be in a city or a relatively large suburb in order to have access to them. Yeah,
I would agree. And the only other thing I would add, because you asked, is it a question of access? And it 100% is a question of access, because like here in Arizona, where we don't have the funding, and we've even, like where we lost the federal grant for early education, that meant that preschool classrooms had to close. So even less families had access to high quality early education programs. And as I said, our enrollment in preschool as a result, has been declining in Arizona, which is completely going in the wrong direction. So I do think that access is a huge issue, and that it does disproportionately impact communities of color.
Thank you. And I think we have time, for one kind of round robin question before we start doing some of our closing remarks. And so I think we have some pretty heavy conversations when it comes to some of these access issues and these inequities. And, as we're thinking about how to create solutions for all these problems, it can be really heavy sometimes and really stressful, and can sometimes weigh on all of us. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I don't think I am. And so I was hoping that maybe we could end on some sort of forward-thinking note. When you are thinking about what in the next 3 years, when it comes to preparing students for kindergarten in a more equitable way, or the next 5 years, what are you really hopeful about? What do you think are some of the really promising strategies? And what do you most want to see in this area for the next few years? So I'll start with Secretary Stewart and go to Albert, and then Superintendent Hoffman to close us out. But I'll give you a couple seconds also to think about your responses before we go.
Well, I'd say what I'm most hopeful about is that we stop talking about the need to make a difference in the compensation and training and recognition of our early childhood educators, and that we just do it, that we actually start compensating them, training them, and recognizing them in the ways that we need to. And that'll take a lot of hard decisions and investments that get made at the legislative level, and both in the state and at the federal government level. But I'm hopeful that we do that, and that we start to build the corollary infrastructure around recruiting those individuals, getting them into the preparation programs, and building the linkages with the public schools that we need to do. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Albert.
I am hopeful that, given what we experienced this past year, that we recognize early education. And I say that, as, from really birth through, the early grades, that, that this is not just quote unquote babysitting, that this is a critical period. Parents I think have always recognized how important it is, and I'm hoping that because of how stressful parents have been the past year having the kids at home, that they appreciate the importance of well-trained, well-qualified early childhood educators. I hope that, I think that businesses are beginning, they've understood the importance of early education, but I think that this has really raised that, elevated that awareness of how critical it is to have this infrastructure, the early care education infrastructure, for the business community, for the economy. So I think, more kind of thinking that we're beginning to see this as a public good, just like public education.
Yeah, definitely, it's a great point. And Superintendent Hoffman?
First, I couldn't agree more with what's just been shared. So thank you so much for those comments. I think what I would add is part of our strategy for how we're planning to re-engage and re-enroll our students in the coming months as we're preparing for the next school year is we're preparing to spend some of our federal COVID relief dollars, some of the ESSER funding, on a marketing campaign that will be to celebrate and to help our communities and our families feel excited about what our public schools offer. And there will be an emphasis on the early education piece, because that's where we've seen the most significant declines in enrollment. So I'm really excited for hopefully this marketing campaign to help us get back on track and help our families to understand all the benefits of early education programs, because I do think that education of the public is really important, and for our families to see, like, oh, if my kids are in a preschool program, like look at what they can do. They can be making friends, they can be learning, and just all the amazing opportunities that our early education programs offer. So that might be more of a short-term goal than what you were looking for, but I think it's a good starting place for us to be focused on over the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I would agree with all three of you. So thank you so much for your insight there. I just want to again thank all three of you for all of your comments today. This has been really illuminating, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us today. We've just got a couple quick logistical closing remarks to make, and just make sure that you are aware of everything else we've got going on here at the Hunt Institute. We've got a few upcoming webinars in our webinar series, various offerings of webinar series. We got a race and education webinar next week, April 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern on criminal justice in schools. And we will be talking about skip year growth on Thursday the 22nd, and that's in partnership with the Data Quality Campaign. And we'll have a governing principles webinar talking about state and federal support for HBCUs on April 27th. So if you're interested in registering for any of those, or if you want to see any of our other webinar offerings, we have about 6 or so a month. Please feel free to visit the Hunt Institute's website, and there will be information on how to register for all of those there. And just finally, when you close out today, you'll be brought to a survey page. That's really just for us to kind of get some internal feedback and kind of use that for our own internal evaluation purposes. So if you have a couple seconds to complete that survey, we would be very grateful. But on that note, I'd once again like to thank Albert Watt, Superintendent Hoffman, and Secretary Stewart for all your remarks today. And if you are interested in any of the Hunt Institute's early childhood work, we have a really great early childhood team who would be happy to connect with you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question today. We had a ton of questions submitted, and we ran out of time, unfortunately, but we are looking into ways that we can get some of those answered. So please keep an eye out on the Hunt Institute social media, and we'll hopefully be following up with some more information. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.